I'm not who you think I am. Whoa.
I really got to format that intro to the size of the screen. Okay, so this is my friend. She's going to make an argument. It's pro homosexuality as Christians. I think it's an interesting argument. So I'm going to play the argument, and then I'm going to give a couple thoughts, and then I'm asking for other Christians out there to respond.
That was intended with the New Testament command. So we have to understand that there's lots of instructions in the New Testament that we don't follow today. Another example is taking up a collection for widows. I have never been in a church that took up a collection for widows. And why is that? Are we just disregarding the instructions of the New Testament? Or do we realize that our cultural situation is different? And so in the same way, the commands, the few places that homosexual acts are mentioned, you know, we have to consider the context. And
I'll say when the main argument I thought was the most interesting comes up.
Context of homosexual practices at the time when the Bible was written included this: sex with slaves, sex with prostitutes, and pederasty, which is an older man taking and having sexual relations with an adolescent boy. Okay, so the context is certainly not talking about homosexual monogamous relationships. It is talking about sexual excesses. These are men who are usually married to a woman who are still indulging sexual appetites in other ways, like with sex with slaves and sex with prostitutes. That is, and with pederasty, that is the context in which the discussions in the Bible are talking about. So we cannot take that context and put it into our modern context. Now, I am not affirming all indulgence of any sexual appetites. I am affirming same-sex monogamous marriage, just like a heterosexual marriage, with the values of being committed, being loving, and being faithful to each other for a lifetime. And I think that kind of gay relationship can glorify God just as much as a heterosexual marriage can. So let's go on, because there's a final response that I want to give to this idea that there's no room for change because of what the Bible says.
People can respond to those comments. I don't hold the same position as her, but I do think this next argument was the one I wanted to focus on. I thought was interesting. I was curious how other people would respond. And I'll make my own comments regarding this argument, and then some hypothetical circumstances that I would wonder how she would respond if they came up regarding her arguments, basically. So let me play this, and then I'll make my comments and close it out. I'm hoping for responses. I'm sure she wouldn't mind hearing responses as well.
There is a glaring problem with that, and I'll tell you why. The same argument was made by slaveholders and people who support Christians who supported slavery in America and Europe. The same thing was made because the Bible does not explicitly outlaw slavery. In fact, it says slaves obey your masters, and it gives instructions. Now it also says masters, be good to your slaves, right? So there's movement in the Bible, but there's not an explicit prohibition of slavery. So Christian slaveholders were using these arguments. Now, thankfully, there were Christians who were not willing to just say, okay, well, I guess the Bible allows it. So that's, what they said. Wait a minute here. There's a biblical principle that is clearly being violated here. Love your neighbor as yourself. And when they looked at the slavery that was going on, they could see that there was something clearly wrong with what was happening between human beings. And they said, no, this is not right. This is morally wrong. Well, today it would not be controversial. It is not controversial at all for Christians to say it is morally wrong to be a slaveholder. It is morally wrong to have slaves. And yet you can't make that argument from what the Bible explicitly says. You have to make that argument based on biblical principles of what God wants for humanity. And so you can make a biblical argument for against slavery. And in the same way, I think you can make a biblical argument for LGBTQ inclusion and affirmation in the church, because although the Bible doesn't explicitly say God's intentions in that area, it does say that we should love our neighbor. Part of loving your neighbor is considering their experience and listening to their testimony. And the testimony of gay people, trans people, queer people is that, hey, this is something innate. This is something that, I can't help. Now, and we'll go into more of that later. So I will go on to objection number 2.
That's the one I'm curious about people would answer. You can see her whole video. Her channel is called The Bread of Life. It's called Bread of Life with a capital B, capital O, capital L. I'll put the link in here to her channel. Also, she wrote a really good book regarding how to engage Muslims from her experience living abroad. She's a highly educated, loving person who is not the average sort of person, I would say. So she's actually had experiences in her life, has education, etc., and is a good person. So a loving person. So, I'm looking for hopefully people who will engage with it honestly. Also, I think if you haven't looked at some of the medical stuff regarding psychology and genetics and things that are the cases of how people are born in different ways and how traumatic events can affect people and how do you deal with that. For me, the issue is often we'll say, well, just don't do gay stuff, right? Can't help how you are. If you're a Christian and you have feelings for the same sex, right? And you have a conversion experience and you're struggling with that sort of thing, let's say, for instance. And so a pastor will be like, well, okay, you just don't act on it. But like, to me, that something's wrong with that, because we always talk about like sin is like a heart issue, right? So like God doesn't just want people that just white knuckle obey him. He wants people that naturally do it. He's going to write his law on your heart. And so we tell gay people, just don't do gay stuff. Well, who's more guilty of homosexuality? A guy who's had a horrible upbringing, an abusive upbringing, let's say, this is just an example. Don't take any offense if I'm not saying everybody's gay for this reason or not, or whatever, but say somebody isn't even gay, but they had a really hard life and they find themselves say having homosexual sex for money or something to keep a roof over their head, but they constantly really would just like a regular life. Okay. Like they daydream and just wish it, but they're callous. They're not, that stuff doesn't they're, because what they've been exposed to in their life, they're willing to do that to make ends meet. And it's just, but it's me. They don't like it. They don't want to do it. They daydream all day about having a white picket fence and a family. Who's worse off? That person who's doing those acts, but wants a way out, but just doesn't see a way out because of their experience. Or I'd say a guy who goes to church and pays his taxes but he dresses up his wife in and he daydreams about just being a total dirtbag and sleeping with everybody of the same sex he could find, but he was brought up in a good upbringing, and that's not right. And his pride says he would be embarrassed to let anybody know it, but he desperately wants it. But he white knuckles a regular life and on the outside. Who's further from God? Which person? To me, Jesus said it's a heart change, right? It's like if murder is bad, so it's like go and sin no more, right? But he also is like, look, if you hate your brother, it's already murder. If you lust after a woman, you have committed adultery, right? So what's going on there? I don't know. I don't have an answer necessarily, right? So I'm just curious what other people would say. I think the argument with the slavery thing is interesting. I would say, well, I'm not going to give an answer, but there it is. So I'll put the link in there. You can watch her whole video on it. But here's some questions I would have. Say, if the church accepted homosexuality, I think I brought this up to her before, but she watches this. I'll just say it like this. Not trying to be offensive to anybody or anything, but let me just consider this. If we say, okay, it's fine, like we accept homosexual marriage the same as man and a woman, so that's normalized, and say it's normalized. What if you have like a kid and he can't find a spouse, and he's struggling with whatever, let's say masturbation and pornography or something, like, and it's affecting his life, and it's one of those people, like Paul says, like, if you're burning your lust, have a wife. You don't have to not be married or whatever. So if we normalize that and someone's struggling with that because they don't have a spouse, like, would it be appropriate to have a same-sex spouse or whichever? Like, what would that just be? Would we start saying that would be a good idea? Like, to find a spouse, whatever you can find or whatever, like in that sort of circumstance? Or would it matter if, only as long as he's not gay, he could have a wife, but if he is gay, it'd be the husband, rather than, struggling with those issues? Or what if they're like, I don't know. The thing for me is, at the end of the day, even if I give all the benefit of the doubt to all the different ideas, it seems like God's intention was for us to have families. That's kind of like my bottom line. So even when I look at the medical literature and I see that people are clearly in no way devious in their feelings or their sexuality, granting all that, I'm still going to think, even if I grant all that the original design was for families. And so it still seems like, even if we were accepting of it because of the reality of say genetic issues and a sinful world or whatever, I'm still going to feel like I have a hard time ever getting over the idea that God's original plan was for a man and a woman having certain traits on average and be able to procreate. And that was like the purpose, because that's kind of how I see is like the Godhead, and his purpose for creating is for family growth and to expand humanity. So I just wonder how someone might answer that too. That would be my objection. But there you go. Curious what other people think. So leave your comments in there. I'll put the link. I said it's Bread of Life. B, capital O, capital L. Bread of Life channel on YouTube. I'll put the link in here afterwards. But there you go. Hope some people will respond and just get some biblical answers or considerations in response.